As the former mayor of South Bend, Indiana, you directed a budget of 358 million in a city of about 102,000. Now you control an agency with a $90 billion budget with a staff of 55,000. You've often touted the benefits of bringing local government experience to your leadership of US DOT, and you filled some of the highest impact positions at the agency with former city leaders from New York City to Portland to Minneapolis and beyond. Tell us about that. What makes local government experience such a key resume asset for you and for the rest of your department?
Well, as you said, I bring a mayor's eye view into the department. And I think having had that experience of being a city seeking federal support is going to be a really important one to tune the ways that this department works to be as helpful as possible to those on the ground. After all, so much of our transportation policy is not actually delivered here in Washington, although it's certainly supported from Washington. It's delivered by the people who are doing the work day in, day out in the transit agencies, the state highway departments, the mayors and the counties that are responsible for roads, bridges, and on and on. What I want to do is make sure this is a department that is as responsive as possible, as user-friendly as possible, and also can recognize the innovations that are taking place in our communities, in our cities, and help spread those and support those. There's no question that this is a different role from leading a city, but it's one where I think I'll be drawing on those experiences, certainly of my own city, and also coming from a city that isn't one of the largest in the country, that didn't have a full-time staff just for the purpose of dealing with places like the Department of Transportation, because I think it's often those communities that are sometimes left behind in the conversations here in Washington.
I'm interested in whether you think there's a role for DOT in areas that have been considered primarily local in scope. I'm thinking about land use and city planning, which has long been considered key factor in reducing reliance on cars, which is something that you've talked a lot about. Is that an area that DOT could increasingly enter into with this sort of city-centric perspective?
I think the power in the decision making really does belong at the local level on things like that. But what we can do federally is provide resources. Sometimes even just a little bit of moral support can go a long way. When we were undertaking some of our infrastructure conversions in South Bend when I was mayor, the idea that you would do anything to a road other than widen it, let alone actually slow things down a bit, which is what we did to some of our most important thoroughfares in order to turn them into more complete streets. That was something that took a lot of pushing locally. And at the time, we had a supportive Secretary of Transportation in Anthony Fox, whose administration really, provided a lot of messaging on why these kinds of steps around the country and communities large and small could be beneficial. So having benefited from that during my time as mayor, I'm very mindful of some of the things that we can be doing, in addition to what might be the most important of all, which is those hard dollars, the actual resources that if we get this moment right, we could have a once-in-a-generation delivery of infrastructure support that can be used by states, by cities, by counties, by tribes and territories. Of course, this is not the first time that a new administration has raised expectations and hopes around infrastructure. So we've got to make sure that this time we actually get to deliver. But I really believe, because of the urgency of the moment, and frankly, the impatience of the public, that with some support and prodding of Washington by local leaders like some of the folks we're gathered with today, we really can get it done this time.
What are the specific projects that you would like to see done as a priority as you work out your agenda for the coming years?
Well, it's tempting to point to some of the most dynamic and exciting new things that are over the horizon, like high-speed rail, the electrification of vehicles. And those are certainly very important. But I want to emphasize that actually a lot of what we've got to do is dealing with a maintenance backlog. Fix it first, I think, is going to be a very important mantra for us. It doesn't always have the same sizzle as adding something new, but the truth is we've got to be doing both, because you look at the conditions of so many of our roads and bridges as a country, and it's just clear that we can't allow that backlog to continue. I remember doing the mental math in South Bend when I realized that the most beautiful newly paved piece of street lasted about 12 years in our climate with our snow and everything that did to beat up the roads. And asking around for a little bit of napkin math, given the dollars that we have, how long would it take us to repave every lane mile of street in the city? And the answer came back about 100 years, which just doesn't compute if you can't get a surfacing project to last more than 10. So the implications of that are partly we just plain need more resources, but also we should be better managing what we already have. There are some places where we may need to add assets like roadways or other transit resources. There's some areas where actually the number of square feet of asphalt in a city probably ought to go down. And we ought to be supporting that kind of right sizing as well if a local community sees that's beneficial for the long term.
I saw Senator Chuck Schumer talking recently about a new subway expansion into East Brooklyn, and there was some pushback about how much maintenance need there is on the New York City subway. So it sounds like you might kind of fall on the latter side of that policy debate.
It's a balance. Look, if there's a need, we should meet it. And I'm a big believer when appropriate, especially when it comes to transit, but also passenger rail, of adding resources that could make a difference. But yes, we've also got to think about the total cost of ownership of the things we're building and the things that we have that Washington hasn't been willing to support. I mean, especially when you consider the situation for passenger rail, where unlike the highways, where there's a highway trust fund with dedicated resources and a predictable funding stream, same as there is for our airports, there isn't such a thing as of today for railways, which I think is one of the reasons why Americans are being asked to settle for less when it comes to passenger rail. I also think we ought to manage what we have and just be smart about it. Now, that's also something that should be a consideration in what we're putting onto the road. For example, one of the many benefits of electric vehicles, in addition to the fact that, of course, they hold a lot of promise from a climate perspective, is that they often have fewer moving parts and require less in terms of the total cost of ownership and maintenance. Something else to consider is we're supporting not just policies that will help individuals get into electric cars, but things like the grant programs that are helping communities purchase low or zero emissions buses. That in turn also supports environmental justice goals, since so often our biggest and busiest highways go through Black and brown communities that are known to have higher rates of asthma. And then you have a public health equity issue if high emitting buses continue to go through them. My point is that all of these things are integrated. The financial side, considerations of equity, considerations of climate, and of course, the foundational mission for this department, which is safety.
I'm glad that you actually went into some of the specifics on that. I'm curious, are there other particular projects or even particular cities that have been leading examples of the kinds of racial justice, climate change centric policy objectives that you're increasingly baking into the DOT's rulemaking and policymaking work?
Well, we're definitely listening to the communities that have been the most intentional about the equity and climate implications of their choices. And that's happening in so many different ways. In some of our biggest cities, you're seeing that there's been a lot of mayoral leadership that's part of helping convince the public to invest more in infrastructure. You look at ballot measures and initiatives that have been passed in Los Angeles under Mayor Garcetti or Austin under Mayor Adler, for example. But it's not just the biggest cities with a lot of resources that we should be learning from. I just had a really compelling conversation with the mayor of Mount Vernon, New York, smaller, lower income community, where she's pointed out that because of the way that community is often cut up by highways and other kind of big pieces of infrastructure, it can actually be easier for a resident there to get to Manhattan than it is to get within the city limits to where the grocery store is. That's why listening is such an important part of federal policy when it comes to how we engage with cities, counties, and towns.
I had one last question for you, if you don't mind, Secretary Buttigieg, and that's on the question of topic of technology. Rather, it's something that you've talked a lot about, and the sort of focus on innovation that you brought to your time in South Bend. From my perspective, reporting on cities, I think that local governments have often struggled with sort of balancing the real world policy objectives with the flashy promise of new technology when it comes to transportation in particular, whether it's self-driving cars, or smart streetlights, vehicle tracking systems. And I'm wondering what you think the DOT's role is when it comes to helping local governments, state governments kind of strike that balance between policy and the allure of the new.
Yeah, so I think for geeks like us, the technologies are always going to be fascinating and attractive, and that's certainly true whether we're talking about the surface side, where you got things from electric vehicles to automated vehicles, dramatically transforming perhaps the future of cars, to aviation, where things very close to the ground like drones and commercial space are all growing at the same time. And of course, opportunities around rail and some of the other things we've talked about. And I'm always interested in more ideas around that. In fact, it was here at CityLab that I learned a lot about digital citizenship efforts that were being pursued in countries around the world that I think we could learn a lot from too. The important thing, I believe, in terms of not getting carried away or keeping our focus, is to remember it's never technology for its own sake. When we're contemplating paying a lot of attention or making a big investment in technology, the question has to be, what problem does this solve? And as we take equity more seriously as a transportation priority, I think it's just as important to ask the question, whose problems will this solve? And if we get that right, then anything we do around technology will be focused on the policy and mission priorities that are why we're here in the first place.